What's up, guys? It's Dr. Doug back with Quick Fix Fantasy Podcast episode 3, I believe. I'm flying solo today because Chris is in Toronto with the boys, helping them out. So I figured I'd just hop on and walk through the slate for Thursday real quick. Probably won't be as in depth of an episode just because there's nobody here for me to talk to. I'm just talking into the void right now. So, bear with me while I try to stumble my way through without my extremely smart co-host Chris. But yeah, I still want to try to keep the same format, and I'll just try to keep things slow and easy here without anyone to banter with. But first thing I'm thinking about is what did I play last week? That's what Chris would ask me is what did I play last week? And so looking at last week in terms of fantasy, prize picks, and DraftKings, I played mostly control and search prize picks. I find I sort of talked about this last week, but I find that the control and the search and destroy prize picks are a little easier to pick off earlier in the day. If you're not sitting there grinding, waiting to figure out what the maps are, control and search are a little less map dependent, and so I find that to be easier. Had played a few of those. Mac under 6.5s are Mac under 6.5s, RCs under 6.5s have been like pretty good for me in the past. Mac against Legion under 6.5, map 2 didn't work out last weekend. Um, uh, but I still like those search plays. I think that some of those are a bit mispriced, and I can get them as soon as those lines get posted. The majority of the bets that I made this weekend were in control unders. I had round robin unders on the Toronto Minnesota control, which all ended up hitting, which was a huge bonus for me at the end of the weekend. I had Bance, Insight, Hixie, and Fame round robin with them in pairs to all hit the under, which they all did. That is the nice thing about control and the ability to play two players from the same game together, as long as they're on other teams, is that in control, if the game goes under, it's likely because the game is shorter, and so you have pretty strong correlation between your plays and control if you're taking them both on the under. So yeah, for instance, 60 hit 18 and Fame had 7 in map 3 of that game. So, and that's just because the game was short. So yeah, that was what I focused on this weekend was like trying to grind my advantages on the as soon as I could when new lines got posted on Prize Picks, trying to get those as fast as I could. I found that was where I was finding the biggest advantage. Um, then, what did I learn last week? So I think the big learning it sort of is reflected in the bets that I made thinking about control, and it's also going to be what I talk about in our little mini lesson here about how we can be smarter betters. But I think control has a lot of value because of the difference between control's mean outcome and like the median outcome. In control, the average game is 4.2 rounds ish. So like the average amount of time that a player spends in a control game is whatever the amount of time a round takes, depending on the map, times the 4.2 average rounds. That's about what a player's average number of kills would be. But 4.2 rounds never happens. A game will never end 3.1 to 1.1 or whatever. So uh, there's this kind of incongruity between the median and the mean results. And so I've sort of been thinking about that in control and trying to find areas where prize picks might be looking at the average kills that a player gets and not considering the fact that like those results are probably pretty skewed relative to the medians for some players. And just thinking about the distribution of rounds, it's really bumpy. Like if one additional round, if we go to round 4 and then a team back caps at the last second, we go to round 5. That's adding like six minutes to the time in the game, which is a lot. I mean, that's 25% longer game than it would have been if the game had ended in 4 rounds. So that's sort of what I've been thinking about is just like how can I take advantage of the fact that control the just looking at averages doesn't really mean quite as much. So that's sort of what I've been pondering a bit. I'm very curious to hear what other people think about this. But I want to sort of use that as a segue into our sort of mini lesson, how we think about mean versus median results. So I have an example here, which is TJ Halley in control this season. So if I go to any number of the sites, I'm going to shout out that Breaking Point has a good PrizePicks lab site, lostful.gg. They do a good job posting about or keeping track of players' stats, and you can look at players on specific maps and stuff. But like if I look at TJ Halley in control, his average kills in control across all maps is 18.3 ish. And so 18.3 kills. But if I look this up on my own, but his median kills, so the number of kills at which 50% of his outcomes are less than that number and 50% are more than that number, is 17. And so we have to think about in prize picks, what we're betting on is that we want the thing that we bet on to happen more than 50% of the time, not happen on average more than that number. So if you're betting over 21 and a half, you don't care if on average they score 30. You want them to score more than 21 and a half more than 50% of the time. Even if they scored 55 kills in a game, you don't get bonus points for going more over 21 and a half or something like that. So the median is really interesting. So here TJ Halley's average kills in control is 18.3, but his median is only 17, so more than a kill difference between the two. So his average is 18.3, so let's say that like the average, we put a prize picks line on 18 and a half. How often has he gone under 18 and a half in control? You would think, well, that's his average, so about 50% of the time. Well, no, it's actually closer to 60% of the time. It looks like 58, 59% of the time he's gone under 18 and a half kills. So if we're just looking at the average, if we just pull up one of these really helpful stats sheets that look at players' average kills for control, we're going to be a bit misled because TJ Halley has a big difference between the median and the mean outcome, the average outcome. And so we say this, his average is 18.3, his median is 17. So 50% of the time he's going lower than that, but he is over under 20 and a half in control versus Atlanta FaZe tomorrow. So that's a number that I'm not saying whether or not that's for sure a good bet, but I mean, it's certainly something interesting and sort of goes with the whole lesson that I'm trying to instill today, which is that like to think about mean versus median results. So like if we wanted to shift this to talk about hard point instead, we sort of lose this edge because in hardpoint, let's say the average game ends 225 to 250, so one team wins by 25 points. Well, the most likely outcome is that that game will end with a 25-point difference between the winner and the loser. And then the next most likely outcome would be they only win by 24 or they win by 26 instead of 25. And then it would go out from there, 23 and 27. So like we have this normally distributed distribution of outcomes for a hard point game. And so if we're thinking about it from a length perspective, like the most likely length is exactly what the average difference is, and then the next most likely lengths are just 1 second more or less than that. And so like in hardpoint, we have this very normal, this very even, symmetrical outcomes. But in control, we don't really have that. Yeah, we add one round. If we go from round 4 to round 5, the entire length of the game increases by 25%. And so like yeah, in a game like hardpoint, you don't really have the same asymmetry. You have it a bit in search for sure, but in control it's just a lot more marked, and that's why I think it's the most interesting in control. So yeah, like I say, the average score in hardpoint it might be 25 points, but in control it's 0.8 points, but a team will never win by 0.8 points, so it doesn't even matter what the average score differential is. And so we care much more about the median. So this has just sort of been my like little soapbox about why the medians can be really helpful when we're thinking about prize picks over unders, is that we really care about what happens 50% of the time. We don't really care about what happens on average, and in control especially, those things can be very, very different. So that's just sort of my little mini soapbox. Without Chris here to go back and forth with, it's more of just, a soapbox, me just talking about what I think is important and not really teaching. But I hope that this is helpful for you. And if you have questions, absolutely feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I love talking about this sort of stuff. Next, I just want to quickly break down the 4 games that we do know already for Thursday, one of them being Boston, which is why Chris is not here right now. But we'll go through the games in order, and I'll talk a little bit about the games games as they relate to DraftKings, since we have the DraftKings slate now as of this afternoon on Wednesday. We have the slate. So the first game is Atlanta FaZe versus Vegas Legion. Obviously, this is a huge game for Legion. If Chris were here, he would be saying that Legion's going to be giving 110% because this game is like incredibly important for their chances to make champs. They obviously get a bad draw playing FaZe. I think it's funny that I think in the first podcast episode we were talking about Atlanta versus Legion and how it's tough because Legion's probably the second best search team in the league right now, but FaZe has been clearly the number one team. So FaZe just gets a really good draw against Vegas where they're strongest at the mode that Vegas is strongest at, and then they can sort of snuff them out in the other modes. Last time they played in Major 5, it was a quick 3-0. Let's see, I've got the scores for that game up. Yeah, 250, 144, 6-1, 3-2, 3-0 for Atlanta FaZe. So Atlanta FaZe, Bet365 has them as minus 600 favorites in the game. Interestingly, they have them as the same favorites as Texas is over Florida. Personally, I think Texas should probably be a bigger favorite over Florida than Atlanta is over Vegas. And when I'm thinking about building DraftKings lineup, I'm thinking about what players have the highest chance to get 3-0s because we know that players are getting disproportionately paid out for getting 3-0s. And so, yeah, anytime I can add a little extra value with that. So I'm a little off the Atlanta guys because I think Texas is probably providing a little more value in terms of chance to get a 3-0 combined with like the actual price. Sell is he the most expensive player on the whole slate? No, second most expensive player on the whole slate at 10.4K. That's a lot. BZ's been relatively quiet recently, 9.2K. Just looking at his game, yeah, 36 points last game. That's a stinker. But before that, he had 4 games of 90 plus. So I think maybe a BZ at 9.2K is interesting. In terms of value, I've talked about Clay before as a good value play, a guy that gets a lot of hill time on DraftKings. Getting hill time is just like a sneaky way to get points, and that's a little more repeatable than kills because you're getting hill time even in losses typically, unless you're getting beat really bad in hardpoint. You're going to be getting some significant points from hill time. So Clay is interesting at 6.2K, almost near minimum possible salary. I think it's very likely that he meets value at 6.2K. So I think he's probably my most interesting like low value play on the slate, just because, yeah, I think it's hard to mess up when you have such a low expectation at 6.2K on DraftKings. The next game is New York Subliners against Toronto Ultra. This is an interesting game because from like a fantasy perspective, I think Hydra and Scrappy are probably like two of the biggest stars, like two of the players that go off the most often facing up against each other. And so like it's a game where, well, Scrappy is the highest price player on the slate at 10.6K. Toronto is decent favorites. I think there's like minus 150 favorites overall. So Toronto's definitely in a better spot here, and like Toronto plays are going to be more popular. But I mean, from a GPP perspective, so if you're in like these big field tournaments where like you want to hit first place or it doesn't matter what place you play in, I think Hydra Captain or including Hydra or New York is definitely not even really sneaky, but just like a really good play because Hydra just has so much upside. Like New York could win this series against Toronto, and you know that Hydra is going to be a part of it. You're not seeing a series where New York backdoors the series and wins 3-2 and Hydra's minus 10 and they still manage to win. Like if they're winning this series against Toronto, I'm imagining it's Hydra going plus 45 or something like that. So I really like Hydra at 9.6K as like, yeah, a tournament play where you're just going, you want all or nothing. If New York doesn't beat Toronto, oh well, chalk it up, go next. But if they don't, I mean, I really like the idea of Hydra being big in this game. I mean, averaging 110 fantasy points a game. So obviously Toronto's a tough matchup, but that's some serious value. Another note here for more from the PrizePicks perspective, I've been talking about control this whole time. Although this matchup is fairly even, Toronto is a much better control team than New York is, at least in my eyes. And the book has Toronto as pretty big favorites in map 3 to win. Toronto is probably the best control team in the league. And so maybe look to that game. We're talking about these unders, games that could be done faster. I'm definitely interested in Toronto to not take this to round 5 in the control, just because Toronto's looked so strong in control recently this season. Recently and this season, I should say. So yeah, I think those are sort of the interesting things. Play Hydra. I'm not super interested in Priesta or Hixie at 6.8 and 6.4. I mean, Hixie is sort of interesting if you think Toronto's going to win, but I think there are safer and smarter plays on the board. If you're talking about like a cash lineup that you want consistency over upside, I don't think Hixie's really going to be getting it done. You've got better plays. I mean, with Texas and Atlanta being huge favorites on the board, like you're going to have some safer plays in those games with potential 3-0 value too. So moving on to one of those games, Optic Texas versus Florida Mutineers. This is interesting because, as I said, the books don't have Texas quite as high as favored as I would have thought. I personally have Texas a bit higher here. I think they're a much stronger team than Florida is, and I think this will be a pretty quick series. I mean, Texas has looked just indomitable right now. So, yeah, I think Texas is a really strong favorites to win this game, stronger than maybe the book might suggest. I think the huge just eyesore when I pull up these salaries for Texas versus Florida is Shotzi, 9.4K on DraftKings, despite dropping 153 fantasy points last game and having dropped 100 plus in all of his last 6 games. Two of those games at sub 9K salaries too. So he was 8.4K, dropped 105, and then was 9.4K, dropped 106, then moved down to 8.6K again and dropped 125 points. So I think Shotzi here, I mean, if you're playing cash, I'm pretty sure you're going to be seeing a lot of Shotzi just because, yeah, at a price like that in a game like this where the high 3-0 chance and Shotzi is playing out of his mind, yeah, it's just a no-brainer. So definitely be on the lookout that if you're looking for a safe play, Shotzi's the play. If you're looking to know what other people are going to be playing, I think you should be expecting to run into a lot of Shotzi on the in the cash game scene. So that's definitely the big thing to note here. I mean, when I pull this up, it's just so obvious immediately that Shotzi's underpriced. I think Ghosty at 7K is interesting. I think that's like probably my second favorite value play. You've got high 3-0 chance that you don't have from Clayet that I mentioned as another like value play. 7K, a little bit more expensive, much higher 3-0 chance, and Ghosty's also a player that just gets hill time, and so yeah, like for the same sort of reason, I really like Ghosty. I think he's a bit underpriced for how much ups or like the the floor that he has. I should say he has just a ton of floor. And those are sort of the only things I see for that game. For the last game here, Boston against Minnesota. This is probably the most interesting game from just a viewership perspective in terms of obviously this game means a lot to Minnesota. Boston has not qualified for champs yet either, so this is going to be like a high priority game for both teams. Boston is slight favorites in this game. We saw them win in controversial fashion on quote unquote land before. Obviously, Minnesota is going to be playing with a chip on their shoulder. They've also made a roster change. They're apparently within the honeymoon period, despite having basically the same roster that they or like fielding players they've had before. I still them beating was it New York? That was shows that they've definitely they might be in their honeymoon period still. So give Minnesota a little bit there. I still think Boston's are pretty good favorites in this game. I know last week we talked about Kremp being a player that has been severely underpriced relative to his performance on DraftKings so far. We see Kremp go up a little bit in price here to 6.8K. I still think that's probably low in terms of average fantasy points per game. He would be the second highest scoring player on the slate behind Awakening. Obviously, smaller sample size with Krem, but I mean that's still pretty questionable, I think, from DraftKings in terms of how they priced Kremp here. So 6.8K for Kremp, I think that's very interesting, especially if you think Boston is going to do well in this game. So that's really the only one I really like. I mean, Awakening at 10K, that's pretty expensive for a player in a game that's like a fairly close game between two fairly evenly matched teams. I mean, I'm paying 10K for players like Dashy or something. I don't really want to be paying that for Awakening. Again, though, if you're playing like a large field tournament game where you just want to finish in first place, Awakening does have that upside. Yeah, he is a guy who's going to potentially give you a ton of points. So yeah, I wouldn't sleep on Awakening there, but we're talking about cash or like we're looking for like yeah, more value from our play. I don't really see that in Awakening. Attach is at 9.8K. That seems ridiculous. I think it's hard to know how he would play. He's only slotted into this roster for a short period. So, yeah, I'm not super excited about that. Vivid 7.6K, not that interesting. Beans 8.4K, that's a little more interesting. 8.4K is definitely a more modest price for a player that does have some upside and has a pretty high floor as well. But yeah, I'm much more interested in Kremp and maybe Awakening in GPP, but that's about it. I think games like this, yeah, just thinking about the slate as a whole, I think when we look and we see these two huge favorites with like affordable players on those teams available, it just makes it a little harder for me to want to chase after guys like guys on Boston or even guys on Toronto, where like it very easily we could be sitting here tomorrow and saying, well, Minnesota was able to get the revenge and beat Boston. Like that's completely possible. And like you don't want to be stuck holding players like, yeah, playing Vivid at 7.6K in those situations, I think. But that's just my take on it. That's how I tend to look at it, play it from the more conservative approach. Like you don't want to get burned when things don't go the way that you're expecting them to go, if the way that you're expecting them to go is not necessarily an 80%, 90% thing to happen. It's just, yeah, these slight favorites can sometimes get people confused, thinking that they're for sure going to win. But yeah, if Minnesota wins tomorrow, I wouldn't even be surprised. So, yeah, just important to keep that in mind. So that's all I really got to talk about. I hope this wasn't too boring just listening to me drone on. I try to incorporate some of my own thoughts here and just go through the games, give you guys some information that would be helpful. Again, my name's Dr. Doug Liebe. You can find me at Doug Liebe on Twitter, or you can follow Chris. I think it's what's his Twitter account? Like WP Chris at WP Chris or something like that, or Chris WP. Um, but yeah, feel free to follow us both. Feel free to follow the Quick Fix Daily Fantasy Podcast. And yeah, feel free to post any questions. Obviously, this episode's a little bit different just because it's just me. But yeah, normally we'd love to talk about questions that people have or things that you think are worthwhile for us to discuss on the podcast. We do these every week. So yeah, absolutely. So with that, I will say goodnight and everyone have a nice day.